So after a short bit of fatigue, we had a short recovery break, and now we'll get into some fatigue again. Matching my previous presentation, I'm hoping to talk to you about what we can do to regenerate from fatigue. So how can we get ourselves off the ground and exercise again? So the goals of my presentation is really to provide you some basic fundamental definitions of recovery and regeneration, talk about the theoretical basis of regeneration, and then provide you an overview of the evidence-based practices that assist our athletes to regenerate. In particular, the fundamentals which we can't forget, the fundamentals of food, fluid, and sleep. I'll talk about hydrotherapy, and then I'll talk about briefly other interventions that are interesting. And I see a few around the presentation hall this morning. And then I'll talk about how we might go about periodising regeneration activities for our different sports. So, what is recovery? It's not just biological, it's not just psychological, it's also sociological. There's a very strong social aspect to recovery that we often forget. So we say this is a multi-dimensional construct, and being a construct, we can't measure it perfectly. Essentially though, recovery, it compensates fatigue, and it restores our physiological and psychological balance, and it allows us back to the level where we can meet the challenges that we could meet before our previous performance. The recovery period is simply the time that it takes for these parameters modified by exercise to return back to the resting levels. And regeneration is simply the processes that underpin recovery that occur following intense training or competition. So they're the fundamental definitions that I'll refer to in the next 45 minutes. So, is recovery important for performance? We all know that when we do a training bout, we get fatigued, and then we recover, we adapt, and we supercompensate. If we train harder, we go deeper into the hole. It might take longer to recover. We have slower repair. It might take us longer to regenerate. And really intense training sessions, that can take even longer again. We might need to allow more recovery after these sessions. What about if we improve our recovery? If we look at some of those mechanisms that have been fatigued that I spoke about in my previous presentation, could we facilitate a faster recovery curve? Could we supercompensate quicker? And then could we do more training in a standard period? Can we get our athletes to do more training with more recovery? We all know with well-planned training, at least, we cycle over and we slowly adapt. Is it possible, if with improved recovery in the same training program, that we can improve our performance? The evidence is not clear yet, but there's some theoretical basis to support this. So, improving recovery after fatigue or damage, you don't recover unless you've got fatigue or damage, we can improve our training performance. Again, this is nice in theory. Any recovery practice that we do should contribute to these goals. It really should underlie better adaptation to training. Hopefully it results in better training quality. Perhaps it can manifest in decreased injury and better resistance to overload. Maybe it can make more robust athletes that have greater repeatability in performance, that can repeat strong performances over time and time again. So maybe recovery is a really important aspect of a training program. We do understand a lot more about recovery than we did, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And what we do know is, whilst we represent studies in groups or averages, individuals respond differently to training, to individual recovery strategies or interventions. So we really need to optimise the recovery that we provide to our athletes. We need to really consider the stress that we apply. We need to consider the training experience that our athletes have. Athletes that are better trained, a greater training history, usually have less dramatic responses to intense training. They cope better. An example, the football club I work with in Australia, in a professional team, the players in the first 2 years of the program can only complete between 70 to 80% of the load that the players that have been in the program for 3 or more years. And we know if we go over that threshold, they end up more injured, and they have poorer performances. So training status definitely has impact on what type of recovery that we prescribe. Age, and we all know as we age, first of all, the older we get, the better we were. But the other thing we know is when we older we get, it was also we recover a lot slower. And you know, as you exercise now, it might take you an extra day or two to get out of bed before you can move smoothly again than maybe it did 10 or 20 years ago. And there is evidence showing, perceptually at least, that masters athletes matched for fitness have worse perceptions of recovery than their fitness-matched younger counterparts. So athletes with the same fitness, same training status, only thing different is their age, perceived to have poorer recovery than their younger counterparts. So it's not a myth. It is totally okay to feel like that you recover slower as you get older. There's not really good research on this, but there is one study that I found that shows that females tend to have a slower time course of response in recovery in resistance training to males. But I must say the research is not strong. And other factors that influence our recovery are the climate, altitude, and time differences like jet lag can also be considered when planning for recovery for our athletes. So these are the fundamental things that we should consider when we're individualising our recovery activities. The other things that we need to consider is, do we need recovery? Are we training to adapt, or are we ready to perform? During the periods of adaptation, of overload, maybe the need for recovery practices aren't as high, whereas if we're about to perform, recovery practices should be prioritised. So what affects our recovery? Now here's an example of an intense training bout, a 2-hour really intense training bout, and what I'm going to show here is a time course of change in different variables that are markers of recovery. Now here we have carbohydrate. 2 hours of exercise, we deplete our muscles of carbohydrate. It might take us 4 or 5 days until we can totally replenish the muscle with that carbohydrate. This next one is inflammation. After intense training, we get muscle damage, we get inflammation. And so it peaks soon after training. It appears with those perceptions of fatigue. And here's the markers of muscle damage. And if we blood measures of muscle damage, they can remain elevated for 2 to 3 days after an intense session. Oxidative stress follows a similar pattern. And soreness, which costs nothing to measure, it's easy to ask, follows a very, very similar pattern to muscle damage and oxidative stress. And we find that after a 2-hour exercise bout, it can take 4 to 5 days, usually about 4 days, until we generally get back to recovery. So this is the recovery period, or the recovery zone. And this is where we can do our interventions to see what we can do to facilitate faster restoration. What things can we modify? We can modify our social activities. Fitness can affect it. The training we can prescribe in this period probably has the single greatest effect. The training that we do in this period has the single greatest effect. There's interventions, hydrotherapy, compression, there's diet, there's age, and there's sleep, are all factors that affect how quickly that recovery period or that recovery turns back to homeostasis. Is it possible, if we get it right, that we can recover sooner and do more training in a shorter period if we get this right with discipline and dedication. The big thing is, before we start looking at the latest scientific findings, let's get the big rocks of recovery right, the fundamentals. The boring things like eating, drinking, and sleeping. What limits our recovery in the short term are simple things like carbohydrate and dehydration. Now, not every athlete can win a gold medal, but they can all eat and drink. So we can get our recovery right. We can get our fundamentals in place pretty quickly. And if we use these regularly and appropriately, we can recover better from our workout and get better quality in subsequent workout. And this has been shown several times in many well-controlled studies. Probably the first study that showed this was in 1980 from Dave Costill, who's a very famous sports science researcher. What they did, they took athletes and they trained them for 2 hours a day for 3 days in a row. They were cycling, and they cycled at the same work rate each day. So they did the same bout 3 days in a row. What they did, they fed one group high carbohydrate and one group normal carbohydrate diet. And just for fun, they took muscle biopsies before and after each bout. And they measured the change in carbohydrate content. So as you'd expect, the first 2 hour bout, they reduced approximately by half their muscle carbohydrate content. They then had their diets of high or moderate diet. The next day, did it again, more muscle biopsies, and they repeated it again. And you can see in 3 days, which might simulate a tournament of your sport, that there is double the carbohydrate available, double the energy available in the athlete just by consuming more carbohydrate. So if we repeated again a time trial, there would be no doubt that the group on the higher carbohydrate would have improved performance because they facilitated the recovery better with increased carbohydrate. Now, here's a more recent study, so conducted 25 years later. And what this did, it was 11 days of time trial running, and they had a group that had high carbohydrate, shown in the blue, and the black is shown a normal carbohydrate diet. And they trained intensively during this period, so over 11 days of intense training. And what we found is the group found is high carbohydrate maintained their speed during the 11 days of intensive training, doing everything out the same except for having more carbohydrate. The group on the normal carbohydrate diet had poorer performances. They had significantly 10% reduction in performance just from not eating carbohydrate. So this is really important for endurance events. Matching that, in the same study, they measured how they felt. So they filled a questionnaire, and every time they said they felt worse than normal to an item, they get a higher number, and a higher value suggests that they're feeling worse than normal. And with the normal carbohydrate, you can see very clearly there, they feel much worse than the group with a high carbohydrate, despite performing worse. But they did the same training, and the only thing they manipulated was carbohydrates. So if you think low carbohydrate, high fat diets are good for athletes, I'd think again, particularly if you're focused on performance. Now, carbohydrate, how does it work? Well, essentially what we've got here is a slide that shows after exercise how much carbohydrate you eat compared to how much gets taken into the muscle. And it's very simple. The more you eat after training, the more you take into the muscle. So if you are an ultra-endurance athlete or an endurance athlete, high carbohydrate diets are essential. It may not be essential for precision athletes at such high levels, but definitely for endurance athletes and team sport athletes, carbohydrates are essential. And the more you eat, the more that gets taken into the muscle. And this is really important after intense training or after competition. Now, there's also been some studies about adding a little bit of protein to your recovery meal, just a small amount of amino acid. And what we have here is 3 groups. And they looked at their recovery of carbohydrate in the several hours in the muscle, so they measured how much muscle carbohydrate was restored in several hours after intense exercise. The first bar is carbohydrate plus protein, the second is high carbohydrate, and the third is low carbohydrate. And what we can see within 40 minutes of exercise, protein and carbohydrate together did increase the uptake. So adding a little bit of carbohydrate can facilitate, protein can facilitate recovery. After 2 hours, the high carb tend to match the high protein, but after 4 hours, the protein diet, the added protein did assist a little bit. Now, this isn't always repeated in all studies, but what it suggests to me, there's no harm in adding some protein to your carbohydrate to facilitate recovery after intense exercise. And in particular, the protein leucine is really important. It also can protect against the breakdown of muscle during that recovery period. This is a similar study which shows the effect on insulin and adding protein. So there's carbohydrate and protein, and high carbohydrate. And essentially what this shows is what adding the protein does. It increases your insulin, and insulin is a hormone that helps facilitate the uptake of carbohydrate in your muscle. So basically how it works. So I suppose the take-home message is adding some protein to your carbohydrate will assist in your recovery after intense exercise or competition. So some simple recommendations. Immediately after exercise, have 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. Now, if you have moderate duration, low intensity exercise, you have lower intake of carbohydrate compared to moderate to heavy intensity exercise and extreme exercise. Again, basically there's a dose response between you train hard, you need to consume more carbohydrate in your recovery meal. And I suppose that's logical. But how we can use that is periodise our diet intake according to our training load intake to maximise our recovery. The other simple thing that we can do, we can all drink. And I'll test that at the bar tonight. I'm sure everybody can drink. All athletes can drink. And for recovery, we know that dehydration definitely affects our muscle function and it affects our ability to make decisions. And we can see as little as 2% reduction in body mass due to dehydration can impair our thermoregulation and can impair our exercise performance. And in extreme cases, it can lead to heat injury. So we need to minimise the loss that we have, or replace those losses at least, in the recovery period after exercise. So we need to rehydrate. So what are the recommendations for improving recovery with rehydration? Well, simply, we should measure our body before and after exercise and replace 150% of that weight in food and fluid after exercise, in the hours after exercise. Consume more than you lose, and that will counteract the weight that we lose through urination in the recovery period. Ingest fluid over a long time. There's no need to drink it all at once in the recovery period. Add salt or electrolytes to the fluid. So most recovery drinks have that. And more sodium, particularly during periods of heavy sweating. Adding carbohydrate or milk protein also assists with the replenishment of fluids. And a recent study showed that, in fact, milk is the most effective fluid for restoring fluid balance after exercise. And that was really surprising. Even better than sports drinks, even better than soft drinks, even better than water. Milk was the most effective. So that's good for the dairy farmers. Interestingly, now this is controversial. The athletes I know love this point. A small amount of alcohol doesn't affect dehydration, but only a small amount. So the message is the dosing, not the particularly when delivering this message. So many of the coaches I work with prefer to ignore 0.7, particularly for their athletes. And rehydration is more effective when consumed with food. So to consume your fluid with food. So they're very simple points that we can take home and use in maximising our recovery. Probably the point that we get most recovery in our life is sleep. And sleep is getting a lot of attention in the research. Fundamentally, we know that we can cope okay with one poor night of sleep, but continued poor sleep can affect our training and can affect our performance. So there are recommendations for having simple, healthy recommendations for sleep for athletes. The simple ones are set intense training before 6 p.m. Not always easy, depending on when you can get access to facilities. For athletes, they're recommended to keep a regular sleep schedule. Don't go travelling around the world to giving presentations to get good sleep. I can recommend that. You need a regular sleep schedule. So try to set a simple time to go to bed and a single time to get up. And if you have lost sleep, maybe a short nap of 30 minutes can be used to make up for lost sleep. Keep away from large meals at night. Avoid caffeine after lunch. Avoid drinking alcohol. Whilst alcohol helps you get to sleep quickly, it actually results in a poorer sleep after. So alcohol does not improve sleep. It actually makes sleep worse. And also avoid drinking too much before going to bed. Otherwise, you need to wake up during the night. Other things, and we've done studies in the players we work with, that simply having screen time before you go to bed, iPad, iPhone, television, that can reduce your sleep by as much as 30 minutes a night, just by having access to screens before you go to bed. So we have a power down hour in the time before we go to bed. We recommend avoid that. Now, it's really difficult convincing young athletes to keep off their iPhones or their iPads, but it's something that can really be used to help their sleep. Other things like taking a hot shower and using the bed for sleeping, not reading or any other activities. The bed should be reserved for sleeping, and that will train your brain to realise that and help you go to sleep easier. Other simple things like setting up your bedroom, dark room, no noise, comfortable bed, and removing technology. Learning how to manage anxiety and stress. And maybe learning relaxation techniques can all assist athletes go to bed and sleep. And the last one, studies have recently shown that cold water immersion. So using cold water immersion for 10 minutes actually facilitates better sleep after heavy training. So that's a simple recovery activity we can use to improve our sleep. Because it reduces soreness is the biggest one, and it reduces the core temperature. So that leads us into now the next section of this talk is to talk about hydrotherapy. So how does cold water immersion, how can this assist in recovery? And this is an Australian rugby team at the Australian Institute of Sport, just doing some recovery activities, using that cold water to help them remove the soreness and the damage after their game to help them recover faster. So how is hydrotherapy supposed to work? It reduces swelling. It decreases core temperature. Some studies have shown it limits inflammation. However, a negative thing, it can limit cell signaling, so the adaptive response to resistance training. It definitely alters your perception of effort and soreness, and it improves sleep. So hydrotherapy is a very effective mechanism for improving recovery in athletes. And I'll show you 3 studies that we've done. Many other groups have done studies similarly, but I'll show studies that we've done because I have them conveniently to demonstrate where they can be used in twice-a-day training, in intensive training, and in team sport training. So what we did, we had a study where we got athletes to come into the lab. They did 7 by 5 minute interval running in the morning, intense running session. And then we compared them doing cold water immersion immediately after that session. So straight after, we got them in the cold water compared to thermoneutral, so just mild water. We gave them 5 minutes of 60 seconds immersion on and off. They had 9 hours rest, and then they came back in the afternoon where we did 7 by 5 minute time trial on a bike. The morning was running, the afternoon was cycling. And our hypothesis would be that the cold water would improve the recovery and help the cycling session in the afternoon. So they basically did 7 by 5 minute all-out cycling, and that was the performance test. I apologise for the busy slide, but essentially what it showed was, whilst there was not any difference in the first effort in the afternoon interval session, the overall work done in the training set, so in the 7 by 5 minute sets, there was a likely increase. Additionally, we also showed that they worked harder. They produced more lactate, and they had a slightly higher heart rate at a lower perceived exertion. So it showed that the cold water can help a small increase in power, small increase in physical output with slightly lower perception of effort. So in twice-a-day training for endurance athletes, cold water immersion might be useful. The interesting thing here, what we have is we asked them how they felt. The black bar shows cold water immersion. The white bar shows the thermoneutral. And the big things that you can see there is they felt less fatigued, less soreness, and they felt better physically, doing nothing different other than the water temperature. That's the only thing we altered. So again, cold water mainly affected the perceptions of how they felt. So cold water immersion can increase training quality on subsequent sessions. It lowers perception of soreness and fatigue. Maybe it's that impact on lower perception of effort can affect the motivation, similar to the previous model I showed earlier, and that can result in better regulation of effort. And therefore, on the basis of this study, we recommend cold water immersion can be useful during intense twice-a-day training. A follow-up study completed at the Australian Institute of Sport looked at comparing cold water immersion, so in cold water, compared to contrast water therapy. And that's where they go in hot water, cold water, cold water, compared to hot water immersion, compared to no immersion at all. So they had 4 groups in this study. And what they did, they had 5 days of really intense cycling time trials. So the time trial was extremely excruciating. They had 105 minutes, followed by 14 minutes of water immersion. But what the time trial looked like, here's a work set. If anybody knows cycling, you can see that it's repeated sprint for 1 hour and 5 minutes, with short recoveries and finally longer sprint efforts as they go on. And at the end, they had a short time trial. Nonetheless, this was a very demanding task, and they did this 5 days concurrently. And each time they did it, they either did it in cold water group, a contrast group, a hot water, or passive. So what did the results show in performance? Talking to coaches, they want to know about the performance. They found the hot water immersion group basically decreased slightly. And you'd expect a decrease in performance after 5 days of intense training. The hot-cold, they were slightly higher. So the hot-cold was slightly higher than the hot water immersion. The cold water immersion surprisingly improved. Whereas if you do nothing in recovery, you get worse. So this shows that hydrotherapy improves, but cold water immersion, in this case, was stronger than contrast or hot water immersion. So recommending in intensified training or periods of heavy training, cold water immersion is recommended. So how does it work? Well, what it does, it reduces core temperature. Again, they showed that it lowered soreness and fatigue. It produced both better sprint efforts and also time trial performance. So on the basis of this study, and this was quite a famous study, one of the early ones, they recommended endurance athletes use cold water immersion when training in heavy blocks. And what about the team sport athletes? Does it help team sport athletes? So in about 2007, we did this study. We published it 4 or 5 years later, but one study in 2009 and one in 2011. What we did, we repeated a similar design in footballers. So we had 2 football teams, and they had a 4-day tournament where they played 4 matches in 4 days. Before each game, we measured their neuromuscular fatigue, their perception, and we took blood. We measured GPS during the match to measure the match activity. And then after the match, they either had thermoneutral water immersion or cold water immersion. And they did this for 4 days in a row, and we had a final follow-up testing at the end. I apologise for the busy numbers, but what this essentially shows is that the cold water immersion and the thermoneutral immersion didn't change their physical performance tests in the morning any differently. They both got worse after 4 soccer matches in 4 days. So there was no difference between the two groups, and they both got worse progressively. Again, this is some blood measures of inflammation and muscle damage. And essentially what it shows is both groups got increased muscle damage and both groups had increased inflammation during the tournament. But again, no different between the groups. But the match activity profile was different. And what we found is, again, it's a complicated figures, but essentially the top figure shows that the cold water group could maintain their high intensity running during the match better. So that wasn't the amount of running, the type of running. They could run more intensely during the tournament than the group that didn't. So we said there's a likely protective effect of cold water immersion on the ability to run high. And the most changes occurred in the third and fourth game, not the first or second game. So there is some capacity to produce that. Now, again, the limitation of this study is a relatively small sample, and we since know that we probably needed a bigger sample to be very confident in these results. But nonetheless, there's a theme occurring. Cold water immersion does help protect performance capacity during intense periods of training. So the recommendations are that immersion for about 10 minutes or longer. And what it does, it reduces the perception of pain. It can impact on muscle damage or inflammation. Now, the recommendations for best effect is whole body immersion. 10 to 15 minutes exposure to the water. Ideally, 10 to 12 degrees if you're going to alternate hot-cold with warm water at 38 to 42 degrees. For continuous, just straight cold water, about 15 degrees is generally recommended as being appropriate for cold water immersion. But this is not a strict rule. Like anything, we can individualise it. And there was a recent paper published last year that defined how we can individualise cold water immersion, or how can we periodise it. So when you've got shorter immersion periods, or you don't have as much muscle damage, you can have shorter period in the water, and maybe the water doesn't have to be as cold. Maybe 20 degrees is okay after smaller, less stressful training sessions. And this lowers the thermal strain, and it might be more suited to older athletes or younger athletes. We know that children take on cold very quickly. So recommendations for adults may not be the same as for children. So that would be probably recommended for children to have less stressful cold water immersion. More intense cold water immersion, say 15 minutes of 10 degrees, for whole body immersion, that's when you have muscle damaging exercise for adults, for larger athletes. Particularly in the football codes we have in Australia, where there's a lot of damage, a lot of collision, this is what we use to reduce the soreness after games. So you can manipulate how much depth of exposure, the duration of exposure, or the temperature of the water to get a different outcome with your recovery. Now, recently there was several studies showing that cold water immersion is counterproductive for resistance training. There's been several studies showing that cold water immersion stops resistance training hypertrophy effects. So if you are working with strength athletes, it's not recommended to do cold water immersion regularly with your athletes because it can limit hypertrophy outcomes. However, endurance athletes have shown to benefit regularly, and even some studies have shown that it can contribute to increase development of mitochondria with cold water immersion. So the current data suggests that cold water immersion does not hurt endurance training. So for endurance athletes, tick. But resistance training athletes or hypertrophy strength power athletes, care must be taken when using cold water immersion regularly. What about massage? I'm sure in Switzerland massage is popular. It's popular in every part of the world we go to. Athletes love it. But the scientific literature is not strong. Studies have shown it doesn't affect lactate removal and no effect on muscle damage markers. There have been some studies in animals to show that it does improve swelling and damaged fibres in animal studies, but none in humans. Despite the lack of evidence, though, nearly every athlete I know loves massage. It feels good. And recently, from Tim Meyer's group, I think Tim's speaking this afternoon, they did an analysis of all the studies, and they actually showed the effects of massage on acute performance is small to trivial. So there are some small effects, but they're not large. So the evidence to suggest the use of regular massage is not strong, but good luck to anybody who wants to take a massage away from an athlete. I don't like your chances of getting away with that. What about acupuncture, acupressure? Well, we can't find any good studies. No strong scientific support. Anecdotally, some athletes say it helps them to relax. I'll remain skeptical, but if me, I'm based on evidence-based practice, I couldn't say there's strong scientific evidence to support its use. Meditation, that's meditation Australian style. There's definitely a calming effect, and particularly in anxious athletes, athletes in period of competition, meditation or relaxation techniques can definitely be effective. How about compression garments? There have been several studies showing some small physiological effects, but they're not consistent. The only consistent effect is that athletes have perceived that they feel better with compression garments. Again, it's working on the brain and it's working on psychology. Perhaps that's beneficial. And more recently, and I saw outside as they came in, there's cryo chambers. Now, what do cryo chambers do? Cryo chambers have 2 to 3 minutes of extreme exposure to cold, and it suggests that this can improve recovery. The mechanisms has been suggested to reduce muscle damage and inflammation. And it's so cold that you have to cover up your ears, your hands, your face, because if you've ever done it, it's very, very stressful. Well, I found it very stressful. In Australia, we don't get temperatures anywhere near there, ever. There has been a couple of studies that have been done, and what they show is that effectively there's some reduction in inflammation and there's some reduction in muscle damage markers with cryotherapy. But I must say there's only a few studies that have been done. There's one really interesting study from the French Institute of Sport that I didn't have time to summarise, so I got an infographic. And what it showed in synchronised swimmers, that cryotherapy during a 3-week period of overload training, having additional cryotherapy did slightly protect swimming performance benefit compared to not having it. Again, it's only one early study, and I'd say that that's probably the most interesting, the best study that's been conducted in this area. There are many other studies that have shown no benefit that I haven't talked about today. But there's enough there to show interest. And there's clearly, if it does no harm, it could be useful. But then it comes back to a logistical issue. This could be related to expense, and it costs money. Is it easier to get cold water exposure, to get cold exposure through cold water? The effect is more potent in cold water than it is in these vans, despite the difference in temperature. So I think that the effect of cooling can be beneficial. There's many different ways to get it. So that's a summary of all the different fundamental recovery techniques and some of the more advanced or more recent techniques that are used. I must say though, like, I'm a scientist and I always want to have scientific evidence supporting everything that we do. But there's also other important inputs that we need to have when making a decision on when using a recovery activity. And that comes back to having clinical expertise. Feedback from the athlete and feedback from the coaches is really important to match together with the level of scientific findings when deciding when to use a recovery activity. It's really important to know that most of the studies I've spoken about today, and most studies, aren't done with high-performance athletes. And one of the criticisms of sports science research is it's not done with high-performance athletes. But that's come from coaches, but the problem is the coaches won't allow their athletes to participate in studies. So I don't know how we solve this problem. But definitely, one way to solve the problem is to get the feedback from the athletes and the coaches and get that qualitative feedback when deciding when to use a recovery intervention. Another thing to be aware of is the impact of most of these studies have looked at the impact of one intervention alone. So when we do controlled studies, we can only manipulate or change one thing, and that doesn't always reflect what happens in reality. In reality, you will use compression, cold water, food, fluid, sleep. You'll use everything you can. And we don't really know the combined effects very well yet. And the other criticism of studies, there's only been a few now that have looked at longitudinal adaptations to training. So whilst we can see acute changes over 1 day, over 4 to 5 days, we don't know what might happen over 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. And that needs further investigation. Despite the limitations, I made an effort to summarise on the plane on the way over here. So this is my subjective qualitative judgment based on the research evidence on the different sports, on what type of activities might be of higher need. But that doesn't mean that they aren't appropriate. Each type of intervention isn't appropriate for each type of sport. I just provide a hierarchical ranking of the different type of recovery activities and how they match to the various sports that you are from. So there's also some important considerations to take account of when planning your recovery activities with your athletes. For example, recovery might become more important when you have to train intensely the next day or you have to compete. It might be less important when you're away from competition or you're not training hard the next day. Maybe you remove recovery to increase the stress, to increase the adaptation for your athletes. So therefore, when planning recovery, you need to understand what are the acute loads, so what training have you completed recently, compared to how long have you been training hard, or is this the first session? And that might inform on whether you need to use a specific type of recovery intervention. You also need to look at the type of stress that you're providing to your athletes. Was this session cognitively stressful but not physically stressful, or vice versa? Was your session creating muscle damage, or was it metabolically demanding with no muscle damage? And depending on the type of stress that you're providing will help you choose the appropriate recovery activity for your sport. Another one is the athlete's injury history. I tend to play the cautious role with athletes that have regular injury history, so therefore training load control is important, but also improving recovery is also of great priority. So how do we periodise the application of recovery? Well, the biggest thing that we can do is control the workload, and that comes from our previous presentation. Control the fatigue for a start, or we know what workload we are providing for a start, and then we might know what recovery is suitable. So we need to quantify the workload and regularly understand or measure the athlete's responses. That can be simple as talking to the athletes regularly, or it can be from short questionnaires. So if we can quantify the workload, we then next need to understand we have to control the workload. And then after we've done that, once we've got the training control right, I think that's when we look at the recovery interventions or the regeneration interventions. Make sure that the recovery interventions are specific to the stress that's being provided. Make sure that we give the extent of recovery matches the extent of the stress. And make sure the recovery activity decisions are made with the future training goals in mind. For example, if we need to train heavily the next day, perhaps we should focus on recovering metabolically and neuromuscularly as a priority. I'll finish off with just some simple rules of thumb, some simple thoughts, and I'm happy to take feedback on these. So if we have a football team, in the pre-season, do we think they have a high priority for recovery or not? I'd say recovery priorities after the first week of adaptation might be lower. Why? We're not competing regularly. By decreasing recovery, we're increasing the internal signal for the body to get fitter. In competition, definitely focus on recovery. And in the finals or towards the end of competition, when games are more important, fatigue is starting to accumulate, perhaps we have a greater need for recovery then. What about twice-a-day training? So a triathlete might have a 2-hour ride in the morning, no muscle damage, but a 2-hour ride. Then they might have a late afternoon running interval session. So what could we do to manipulate the recovery there? Well, first of all, we could do something like this. We could remove carbohydrate at night to give them more stress for the training session in the morning. So provide a bigger signal for the training session. But after the training session, then we could provide the food. So if you take away the food, you get a bigger signal during the event, during the session. After the session, we can take away the carb, we can give that food and cold water and maybe a nap. That sounds good. Then allow them to recover for the afternoon interval session. And then after running, perhaps cold water immersion to take away the soreness and perhaps a massage. Could be some periodization. What about a team sport athlete who might have a 90-minute session in the morning and a resistance training session in the afternoon? Now, they need to train intensely, so carbohydrate is a priority in the morning. Again, cold water immersion possibly after the morning session and some rest. But in the afternoon session, and we know that cold water can limit hypertrophy responses, maybe we don't provide any cold water immersion after the resistance training session in the afternoon. Just tell them to go home and get a good sleep. That's one way we could look at it. Now what I have here, the finish off, is a typical week in a team sport with 7 days between competition. So what we've got in the red is the game day, and then we've got minus the game day and then the 6 days after. So what we have is a typical training loads might look something like this. So the day before a game, the recovery interventions are periodized. We need to maximize carbohydrate intake. We need to have good sleep, although that's not always easy before competition. Sometimes massage is good, despite the lack of evidence. And maybe contrast water therapy can be some players like to have. After a game, this is definitely where the athletes are most stressed. That's when cold water immersion, compression, food and sleep become prioritized. The next day, maybe some low activity, very light active recovery, some water immersion, food, some social recovery away from competition, and sleep can be prioritized. During the week, massage and active recovery can be prioritized, and then after the hard training session, we're starting to refuel again for the next game. So food, social recovery on the day off, and then we start again the cycle. And this is just a simple way where you can plan different activities to meet the different training goals of the sport. So I had 45 minutes. I think I'm almost there. So what I've spoken to you today in two presentations is really about how we can manipulate the fatigue recovery cycle. As coaches, you prescribe training by intensity, volume, mode, and frequency. That's what we do. That provides the training stimulus. That stimulus provides the fatigue. That fatigue gives us our response to training, which is a signal for getting better. But if we want to train more, we need to recover. And how we recover affects what we prescribe next. So it's a feedback loop. Hopefully I've shown you today the factors that you can manipulate to increase your training stimulus. Whether that be sleep, your fitness levels, your environment, your psychology, or gender. Now your recovery though, we can manipulate various physiological aspects, environmental aspects, you can affect your lifestyle, nutritional, there's even pharmacological and psychological aspects that we can modify to improve or affect our recovery. And hopefully in the last hour and a half that you've learnt more about these aspects. And I'm hoping you go away from here today with a better understanding of the complicated genesis of fatigue, but also the way that we can recover from that fatigue through regeneration. So recovery activities promote regeneration, and it's an essential part of adaptation. There's very simple things we can do with food, sleep, and drinking, but there are also some other interventions that we can do to improve our recovery. But be very careful not to use these blindly. Some of these interventions can be counteractive to your sports. So hopefully you've learnt more about that today. Recovery, just like training, should be strategically periodised to the individual athlete and the specific stress that you're providing. And within that, also there's logistical constraints like finance, budget, and access to resources. By no means am I saying avoid fatigue. Fatigue is necessary. Fatigue needs to be programmed. Fatigue is what we need to get better. But we should also be able to recover from fatigue, because if we don't recover from fatigue regularly, that's when we get into danger of overreaching and overtraining. And hopefully you've got a few more tools today that can help you inform your training practices. So take-home message: refuel, repair, rehydrate, and relax, and it'll be okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. We will take 5-6 minutes for 3 questions.
Sure.
Okay for you?
Perfect.
Okay, we'll start with the first one. It will come directly on the screen. 2 Fragen aus dem ESI, die wir bereit gemacht haben. You can see them right now here.
Here we come.
At least before. Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so where is the biggest opportunity to do this in team sports? Well, I have a whole other presentation on this topic, but we haven't got time. Definitely, microtechnology provides us a lot of advantages in that we can now understand the interventions that we're providing. And the biggest advantage of GPS now is exactly that. We understand what we're doing to our athletes. We now have systems from using this for over a decade